Tonight we're talking about the topic of Devorah that's found in this week's Parsha in Vayishlach. A little bit of a connection, we'll see at the end, with the more famous Devorah in Navi, the Shofetes, who was a judge of the Jewish people in the times of the Shoftim. So, just to introduce the topic, because I think a lot of people don't know that there is a Devorah in Chumash. She gets one pasuk, that's it. Which is not so great, but it's better than a lot of us, so it's a good start. So the Torah tells us, this is in source number 1, Vayavo Yaakov Luza. This is, in this week's Parsha, we have the story with Dinah's rape, and the way that her brothers avenged the rape, and killing the people in Shem. And then, after that point, Yaakov basically picks up and says, we need to get out of here. And really Hashem says to Yaakov that they should start moving, and that's where this part of the story takes place. So Yaakov arrives in the city of Luz, Asher Be'eretz Canaan. Now he's back in Israel. He Beis El, which is also known as Bethel. Hu v'chol ha'am asher imo. Yaakov and all of the camp that was with him. Vayiven sham mizbeach. So there Yaakov built a altar. Vayikra la'makom kel beis kel. And he gives it that name. Kisham niglu elav ha'elohim bivarcho mipnei achiv. Because that is where God appeared to him after he ran away from his brother. And then out of the blue you have pasuk ches. Vatamas Devorah meinekes Rivka. And Devorah, the nursemaid or the nurse of Rivka, dies. Vati kaver mitachas lebeis el tachas ha'alon. She's buried beneath this alon, this tree, in the city of Bethel. Vayikra Shimo Alon Bachus. And they named this place Alon Bachus. Bachus milashon, from the term of Bechiyah, from crying. Bachus in plural, the tree of tears. And that's the only reference to Devorah that we have. And the big question, of course, is who this Devorah person was, why she's mentioned here all of a sudden. So, if you look back in the end of Parshas Chayei Sarah, you find the story of Eliezer searching for a wife for Yitzchak, searching for Rivka. And at the end of this Parsha, at the end of this story, Eliezer basically convinces Besuel or Lavan and then Besuel that Rivka should go with them. And Rivka's excited to go, but they're not so sure. And they leave it up to Rivka. That's how the story ends. Vayikru leRivka vayumru eleha. This is not on the sheets. In Parakaf Dalet, in Parshas Chayei Sarah. They called Rivka and they said to her, Haselchi im ha'ish hazeh. Do you want to go with this person or not? Vatomer elech. And she says, I want to go. Vayishalchu es Rivka chosam ve'es meinekta. They sent Rivka and her nursemaid, ve'es Eved Abraham ve'es Anashav, and the servant of Abraham, that's Eliezer, and all of his people. So they send Rivka with her nurse, this person from the house, this slave, servant, whatever you want to call her. So if you look at Rashi, on this pasuk about Devorah, what do we have here? Tamas Devorah meinekes Rivka, the nursemaid of Rivka. So says Rashi, Ma inyan Devorah beveis Yaakov. So Rashi says, what is Devorah doing here? If she works for Rivka, where should she be? With Rivka, not with Yaakov. Elo l'fisha amra Rivka liYaakov. So rather, because Rivka said to Yaakov, V'shalachtiyo kafticha misham, that she says, go and run away to the house of Lavan, and when everything is safe and sound, I'll call you back. So what happens? So Shilcha Devorah esol lePadan Aram. So Rivka sends this servant, Devorah, on a mission to find Yaakov and bring him home because it was safe. Umesa badarech, and she died on the way. Presumably she died after she found Yaakov. She died on the way of bringing Yaakov back. And that's where Rashi quotes me, Divrei Rav Moshe Hadarshan Limantiha. I learned this from Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, who Rashi quotes pretty frequently. So who is this Devorah? So Rashi, and we'll see some other Mefarshim also, all assume that this is that same person. And that's the foundation of Rashi's question. The foundation of this question is, if Devorah works for Rivka, what's she doing with Yaakov? Ella, so what must it be? It must be that Rivka sent Devorah to go and get Yaakov and bring him home. So the Ramban here has a series of questions, and he's bothered by what Devorah is doing in this parsha. It comes out of the blue. I would ask it in maybe a slightly different way, which is, why now, of all times, do we mention Devorah by name? In Parshas Chayei Sarah, they don't send Rivka, they don't send her alone, they send her with Eliezer and with people, and they call out specifically Meinikta. They send her servant, her nursemaid. Why not mention it there? And here, when Devorah dies, we mention her name, that she died there, and it doesn't even say that she was sent. This is all Rashi's suggestion, or Moshe Darshan's suggestion, that she was sent back and then to get Yaakov, and then she dies. And here we find her name. So it's a pretty strange thing. Why here and why not there? Why not in Parshas Chayei Sarah? So the Ramban has a second question. We've talked a lot about the Ramban in the past weeks. And Ramban here has a different question. And that's what you have here in source 3. The Yitachen, he says, and it would seem, she'ein hi hameinekes shenemar bar vishachu es rivka chosam v'esmeinekta. The first thing the Ramban tells you, at least in the source here, there's more to it, but this is the part that I provided for you on the sheets. The first thing the Ramban says is, I'll tell you who this is not. And this is not the girl that was working for Rivka when she was sent to marry Yitzchak. How do I know this? So the Ramban says, answering Rashi's question, how did Devorah end up with Yaakov? Devorah lived in the house of Lavan, lived in the house of Besuel. She was somebody else. And when Yaakov picked up and he left, so he took people with him also to return to Eretz Yisrael. And Devorah was one of the people that he took. And now Yaakov brings her back with him to take care of his mother in her old age, for kavod, to respect her. Because that's the way that things used to be done, at least. That people would have meinikos here as an expression. She was a nursemaid, she was a servant, and if you had one servant, that was enough, but 2 servants was better. So the more, the better. And Yaakov comes home to bring his mother some help around the house. So he brings Devorah along the way. Why? Why is the Ramban compelled to say this? Why not assume like Rashi that this is the same Devorah, this is the same Meinekes, the nursemaid in both places? Because what he says, Ki rachoku shetia hazekina hashliach shetishlach imo liyaakov k'divrei Rav Moshe Hadarshan. It's hard to imagine that this old woman is the shliach that was sent to get Yaakov. When you read Rashi's like these, Rashi says, who's Devorah? So Devorah in the parsha is referring to the nursemaid that took care of Rivka when she was a kid, and Rivka sent her back. And you don't even think about it for a second. Even though, how old was Rivka now? I mean, we know this is right before Rivka dies. I don't know exactly how old she was, but she was pretty old. How old was the nursemaid that took care of her as a child? All I can tell you is she was old. Rivka was 3 when she got married, right? So maybe the nursemaid was a little bit older than she was. Maybe she was at least 5, But she's pretty old. And of all the people in the house, so who do you send? So you send the oldest woman in the house to go trek through the desert to go find your long-lost son. It doesn't make any sense. So Ramban says it's just hard to imagine, if you're going to assume like Rashi, that this woman was sent with Rivka initially, that she would be sent back, and then that's who this was. And again, the second question, why mention Devorah by name? So who is it? So this is somebody who was in the house the whole time. Now she was also probably in the later stages of her life, but she wanted to see Rivka. Yaakov thought it was important to bring people back to the house, so Yaakov thought she would probably survive the trip, and she didn't. But it's not the same person. Okay, so it's not the same person. So who cares? You have to ask that question in Chumash, right? Who cares about Devorah? What does she matter in terms of the story? She's a random person who is an assistant in the house of Lavan or Besuel of all people, and Yaakov decides to bring help home to his mother when he shows up after all these years of being away, and one of the people on the staff passes away. Okay, so it's sad, but who cares? Now, you could ask the same question on Rashi. Let's just be intellectually honest here. who really cares about Devorah if Devorah was the one that was sent to get Yaakov and then she died? At least maybe you could say, according to Rashi, that there's value in knowing that Rivka didn't give up on Yaakov. There's some message there that Rivka fulfilled her promise to Yaakov that one day I will send for you and it will be safe and you'll come back. But then the question is, why send somebody so old?
Who she trusted very much.
Right, maybe somebody she trusted to fulfill the mission. But again, not at the expense of risking their life. Now, Yaakov didn't think she was too old either, according to the Ramban, because he probably wouldn't have brought her back then. So it's tricky to figure out, but there's really nothing here. And you look around the Mefarshim, you look through the search for Gemaras that talk about this person, and there's nothing out there. I didn't put it on the sheets, but a few weeks in a row we quoted from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And in his comment on Chumash on this pasuk, I should have brought it, but I didn't. He basically says, you can tell me whatever you want about Devorah, and it's all possible because there's nothing to say. She's just this mysterious one pasuk character, maybe two pasuk character, according to Rashi, and there's not so much to tell you. And if Hirsch writes, there's nothing to say. You could say that she was this. He's referring to this machlokus. You could say she was from the house of Lavan, she was from the house of Rivka. Okay, like it's just hard to pick up. There is one lesson, one level to this pasuk that does appear in the Midrashim that you find floating around, and this is where I started to look into this topic. I was looking for Torah. I didn't know anything about her before 2 weeks ago. I started looking into this topic and fishing around to see what I could find, and this is the Midrash that comes up everywhere. The one thing about Devorah, but it's not really about Devorah. The Midrash is in Parshas Kiseitze in Devarim, and it's source number 4. The Midrash says, "V'Rabbanan Amri, Garam la shelo teitze mitasa barabim." This caused that Rivka's coffin would not be brought out in public. Are there more copies still? And it's worth pointing out when we start this Midrash, you don't know anything about the death of Rivka. There's not one pasuk that mentions it. Everybody else's death, right? Everybody else's death is mentioned somewhere, right? But obviously some of the more famous ones, Rachel's death is mentioned, right? The way in which the Avos' deaths are depicted in the Torah is interesting, that they kind of go up to heaven, whatever that means. There's no mention of Rivka dying at all. So, not only is Rivka's name not mentioned, not her death is not mentioned in the Torah, but Rivka didn't really have that many people at her funeral, according to the Midrash. Atamotze kishemesa Rivka. You find that when Rivka died, Amrin, the people in the area, said, Man yipo kama. Who will go out before her, meaning who will lead the coffin to the ceremony of her funeral? Avraham Mace, her father-in-law Avraham, is dead. Yitzchak Yoshev Bibayis, Ein of Chaos. Her husband Yitzchak sits at home blind. Right? We know from the end of the story that with Esav, that whatever the Midrashim say from the Avodah Zarah, that the incense that Esav's wives were burning, Yitzchak lost his vision. He's still alive. Yitzchak dies in this week's Parsha. So Yitzchak's still alive, but he's not really capable of burying his wife. He doesn't leave the house. So Yitzchak's not an option either. Yaakov, what about her son Yaakov? Halach lo lepadan aram. He's in a different country. There's no telephone, there's no email. He has no way to know that his mother died. So who's left? Esav. Yipok Esav Rishai Kama V'Yimro Naitan Briasa B'Zisa Kedin Yanaka. You have to know some good Aramaic here. So the people said, so who's going to come out? Esav Arasha? That's who's going to honor this woman in her death? This evil, notorious person, this figure, is going to be the one who's going to bury the holy woman Rivka? Ma Asu. What did the people do? Hotziu Mitasa Balayla. They took out her bed or her coffin at night. Shelo Yehei Esav Yotze Lifaneha, so that Esav should not lead the procession. V'yiu Hakol Omrim, and everyone would say, Arurim Shadayim Sheinik Rasha. People should say, cursed is the woman who nursed this evil person. Unbelievable Midrash. Unbelievable Midrash. So they buried her at night. And they buried her so that Esav wouldn't show up. And she had no family, or no direct family, at the funeral.
So who buried her?
So whoever else was around in the area. I don't know. I don't know if it was people that lived in the house, servants or whatever, if it means people from the community, I'm not really sure. But we do know from the Midrash is who didn't bury her. And I just think it's unbelievable that they avoided Esav. There's a discussion about, there are a lot of halachos of how funerals are supposed to be conducted and who the funeral is for. This came up in something we were discussing in the Kola last week. The Gemara has this discussion. Is the opportunity to eulogize the deceased relative an honor for the relatives that have lost? Or is it supposed to be for the honor of the person who actually passed away? The Gemara asks this question. We find by Sarah's death, Sarah dies when Abraham is away with Yitzchak at the Akedah. And the Psukim give you the impression that the funeral waits for Abraham to get back. And the Gemara debates if that was for Abraham, a schus for Abraham, that they shouldn't go on without him, that if his wife passed away, he should have the right to stand up in front of the community and express his loss. Or if it was the opposite, that the reason that they waited, even though they shouldn't have, was for Sarah's sake. That her funeral wouldn't have been the same without her husband there to say something about her. And the Gemara gives numerous examples of this, but Abraham and Sarah is where that Gemara takes off. So it's interesting here that this is not just, this is very tragic. And Esav is the only person left, and the community realized how terrible it would be. I'll tell you a horrible story, which is this Midrash reminded me of this, but I had a Rebbe of mine in New York who for a while, before he was teaching in Yeshiva University, or while he was teaching in Yeshiva University, he worked at a Shul. And the Shul, he said, he had never been to a place with such terrible politics. Shul was split 50-50, down the middle. Half the people would talk to each other, not the other half, and the other way around. One group would go to Shal Shuddas, the other group would stay upstairs and learn the Shir. He said it was horrible. He walked into a situation that he knew nothing about. He said it was his Gehenim Ba'olam Hazeh. That's what he told me. It was that bad. So he got a phone call from a woman one day in the shul, and she said, my husband passed away last night. So she wanted to take care of all the funeral stuff. So he said he was totally shocked. He had no idea. He hadn't seen the guy in shul, but he didn't know them so well. He was new. He couldn't figure out what was going on. So he said, what, like heart attack? What happened? He had cancer for the past 6 months. So he felt terrible as the rabbi. He said, like, how didn't I know? Nobody told me anything. And she said, we didn't tell anybody because we were afraid of what people in the shul would say. And he told me himself that he heard people speaking the day after the funeral, and she was right. Unreal. And he just said to me, can you imagine what kind of place this is? He says the worst thing he'd ever seen in the Jewish community. Terrible, terrible story. And I remember we spoke about this topic and the idea of honoring the mace and making sure that the things that are said about the mace, especially at the funeral, but even beyond that, at the Shiva house and during the Shloshim, that things should be said that honor the person for what the person was really about and what the person dedicated their life to, and not focusing on things mistakes that they made, even if it's true. That's a priority that we have to have. And here, in this Midrash, it just reminded me of it. It's kind of a sad story, but the people in the community were so concerned about Esav HaRasha. Can you imagine the way people would talk? Well, what's he doing here? What's that guy doing here? I've seen him in such and such a place. And they'll say, oh, that's her son, her oldest son. That's her son? They were so concerned about the way that she would be spoken about that the people of the community took action and made sure that Esav wouldn't be there.
But Esav always honored his parents. That was the one that said he was the best friend. So
honored his father.
Only his father.
But true. And the question also, it's not that people would say, it's interesting.
He was quite known for doing such terrible things.
Right, Esav had a bad reputation, but it's also hard to steal that right from him.
So he only honored his father, not his mother.
Well, I mean, maybe honored. It's clear that those examples that they give are the way that he honored Yaakov, or the way that he honored Yitzchak, the way he spoke honestly, the way he spoke creatively or connivingly to his father. Now, we talked about this in the past. it's not necessarily so fair to judge Esav based on the psukim. We pointed that out. That Esav is given a really bad rap, and it's not necessarily so fair, at least from the way that the Torah describes it. That's fine. I heard a beautiful thing last week, total tangent, but a beautiful Dvar Torah I heard last Shabbos, that Lavan's the same way. That Lavan always says the right thing. Lavan always has an answer for everything that he does. Lavan is what do we say in Haggadah? Vayishlach es hakol. What did Lavan want to do? He wanted to wipe out. He was going to destroy the Jewish people. Relative to Paro, in the Haggadah, Lavan is worse of a person than Paro was, enslaved the entire Jewish nation, because Lavan was Vayishlach es hakol, wanted to destroy it all. And Lavan seems pretty decent in the Psukim. So the suggestion that I heard that was unbelievable is that Lavan always has an answer. Lavan is that person who always thinks he's right. He always has a different narrative. He always has what to say. And the Torah paints it that way because that's what it was like dealing with Lavan. Lavan never made any mistakes. He never owed anybody any favors. Habanos binosai, habanim banai, the daughters, those are my kids. The sons, those are my sons. He always has an answer. That doesn't mean that he's right. But it doesn't mean that he always thinks he's right.
And that trait is terrible. It sounds like it's worse than Paro, so it's...
Well, what Vayishlach es hakol means, it's also relative. If he wanted to prevent the Jewish people from Yaakov from marrying the right wife, in that way he would have ended the future of the Jewish people on a smaller scale. That's how always I thought the simple explanation was. When you're dealing with the Avos, things are much more sensitive. If someone threatened Avraham Avinu's life, so basically, from a historical perspective, he threatened the life of the entire Jewish people, which is probably why the Gemara says that when a person saves one Jewish life, it's like they saved an entire world, looking forward towards the future. It's a lot easier to appreciate that in retrospect. Someone tried to kill Avraham Avinu, he was just another guy.
And it would be knowingly or not, intentionally...
Right, did Lavan understand the consequences of what he was necessarily doing? Paro did understand the consequences of what he was doing.
Right.
I wonder if Lavan did or Lavan didn't. I don't know. Who's to say?
I think he did.
Maybe? I don't know. But this is Esav, and Esav Harasha, who in the Midrashim is depicted as this terrible person, it wasn't just this internal family thing that he was trying to get back at Yaakov for stealing his brachos, and that everybody knew who he was. And to go back to your question from before, so was Esav respectful of his parents? Sure. But was that so clear to the community? This violent person, who everybody knew, so very nice, when he came home and his father walked in the room, he stood up. But the people on the street, the people that dealt with him in business, know exactly who they were dealing with? They did know. Even if Yitzchak didn't necessarily know. So this is Esav Harashan. The people say there's no way. We're not going to let this go. This is the funeral of a special person. And there's going to be no tolerance, zero tolerance for anything disrespectful. And, yeah. And they buried her, and they did it in the middle of the night so that no one would know. And that was in a sense, a terrible end to an amazing life of someone who came really far.
It's a good thing that they did that. It shows a lot of...
I wonder. It's pretty sad. It's pretty sad that her husband couldn't make it out, and that her younger son, who couldn't make it back. It's a pretty sad state. And maybe relatively, we were better off having Esav not there than being there. But then she had no family, no direct family at her funeral. I would assume that her side of the family for sure didn't come. Basul had already passed away, according to the Midrash at least. Lavan's dealing with Yaakov. He's not any closer to home than Yaakov is, so there's nobody there. The community does it. It's amazing to me the way that community reacted. Maybe this is a Chevra Kadisha discussion. Do they have that up here, the Chevra Kadisha Shabbos, like they do down south, where they do that? I don't know. I never heard of that before I came to Toronto. So that's the Midrash.
So if you have one really bad child, then you'll be buried secretly at night. If you're lucky. Yeah.
So the Ramban points out, and there's more to this Midrash. This is a longer Midrash than we have in front of us on the sheets. But the Mefarshim point out that if you look at these psukim, how do you know what happened when Rivka died? So the Midrash points out, and Rashi quotes it here, I believe Rashi quotes it, that they called this place Alon Bachus, the tree of tears. It's not Alon Bechiyah, it's not the tree of a tear for the death of Devorah, going back to Devorah, but it's Alon Bachus, multiple tears, a tear for Devorah and a tear for Rivka also. Because when Devorah arrives, or sometime shortly after, we find out that Rivka dies also, or at least Yaakov found out. And Alon Bachus is where the Mefarshim say, and the Midrashim say, that now we know that Rivka passed away. Because when they cried here, they cried intensely. They didn't just cry for Devorah, but they cried for the death of Rivka as well.
So you're saying that there's no reference in the Torah to Rivka passing away.
Zero.
But there's a reference to Devorah, right? Which doesn't make sense.
So that's the question. If it's true that the Torah and the Ramban, well, actually, you know what? Let's see in the Midrash a little bit further. So we left off that they took Rivka's body at night. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina. So this is 3.5 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina would say, "Lefi shehotziu mitasa balayla, lefikach lo pirshu haksuvim misasa." Because this goes back to the point of, was this a disgraceful burial in the end, or was it not? Because they buried her at night, therefore the Torah does not discuss her death explicitly. Ela min hatzad. Where does the Torah talk about the death of Rivka? It talks about it in a roundabout way. Shenemar v'tamas Devorah minekes Rivka v'yikra shemo Alon Bachus. That Devorah dies, and they call the place Alon Bachus. And the Midrash goes on to explain multiple tears refer not just to the death of Devorah, but to the death of Rivka. So Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina says an unbelievable thing, which is that even though what the people did for Rivka's passing was an honorable thing, ultimately this is a tragic end to her life. And the Torah is not about to go and write for the generations, you should have seen the funeral of Rivka, because you shouldn't have, because it was that bad. So the Torah only references it through Devorah. So now this got me thinking, why Devorah? You want to tell me that the death of Rivka is not something that's worth stating, it's not appropriate to state it explicitly. So we mention it upon the death of Devorah as if, okay, we'll just tack on another one, just put them all together. But that doesn't seem to do Rivka any justice either. And maybe inversely, the question is, why does Devorah get that kind of recognition? Going back to the question from before, why do you have Devorah's name mentioned now of all places? It doesn't really matter who she was. The point was that she died around the same time as Rivka, and they mourned the loss of both of them. So I heard a very interesting explanation. I found this online. A beautiful story about the Chassam Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger was one of the great European Achronim, lived in the end of the 18th century into the beginning of the 19th century, mid-1700s, early 1800s. And he is known for his extremely brief and cryptic commentaries, a little bit on the Gemara, a little bit on Shulchan Aruch, a little bit on the Rambam. There are these comments of Rabbi Akiva Eiger that are very difficult to put together. He only wrote in note form. And that's how it was reproduced. And a lot of times you have to struggle very hard to figure out what he was talking about. But he was a tremendous, tremendous genius. And his daughter was the wife of the Chassam Sofer, who was also lived around, was almost the same age, I think, as her father. But Chassam Sofer was born a few years after Akiva Eiger and died a few years after as well. And you have a very interesting story that's reported. I don't know if the story is true or not, but the story that's recorded is that the Chassam Sofer and his wife were living in Pressburg, and they got word that her father had passed away. I guess back in the day, it wasn't so easy to find out. By the time they found out, the funeral had already taken place. And the Chassam Sofer saw that it was appropriate that there should be a hesped in the house for all of their children to know about their grandfather. And apparently some or all of their children had never met their grandfather. They had never met Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So you can imagine, the Chassam Sofer was in his own right a tremendous Rav. He had a tremendous amount of influence in Europe, and he dealt with a lot of different issues, and his writings are still as much relevant today as they were 200 years ago. And he got up in front of his family and I guess friends, whoever was there, and he said to his children, he said, "What am I supposed to tell you about your grandfather? You never met the man. You didn't know anything about him." And he says, "I doubt you would appreciate how great he was." He said, I understand how amazing of a person he was. But how are you supposed to understand it? And he said, there's only one way you can begin to appreciate who Rabbi Akiva Eiger was, and that's to look at his daughter. If you want to get a sense of what your grandfather was like, the best chance you have is to look at your own mother. And to realize how special of a mother that you have, and how a woman like that doesn't come from nowhere. And at least in that way, you start to get a sense of who she was, of who Rabbi Akiva Eiger was. And he said, unbelievably, that was probably the message of this connection between the death of Devorah and the death of Rivka. Yaakov's children never met Rivka. Reuben, Shimon, Levi, down to Yosef and Binyamin. They never met their grandmother. It's interesting to think about. They were raised in a totally different area. And they get word, Devorah's death, and they were there when Devorah passed away. And at the same time they get word that their grandmother had passed away also. And he said, how are you supposed to appreciate what this woman was like? And you can imagine Yaakov telling them, you grew up in Lavan's house. You know what it's like to be a part of that kind of environment. And your grandmother took that chance with Eliezer, Eved Avram, and made that trip at 3 years old because she had the opportunity to do something better with her life. And she makes that trip and she marries Yitzchak and she becomes the matriarch of the Jewish people. And you never have a chance to appreciate what that's like. But you do know Devorah. And you met this woman, who, depending on which interpretation you take, had a serious interaction with Rivka and was apparently influenced by Rivka's behavior. And if you want to get a sense of what your grandmother was like, at least take a look at Devorah. At least see who this person was and how they were capable of overcoming the challenges of Lavan's house and to make themselves tremendous people.
So was Devorah with them when they were growing up at Lavan's house? Was Devorah...
So that depends. What we said at the beginning, it depends. According to Rashi, I assume this Chassam Sofer story works very nicely with the interpretation of Rashi, that Devorah was there with Rivka when she moved in with Yitzchak. She was there. She was someone that was very closely involved with Rivka. She was influenced by Rivka. She followed Rivka on her journey to Eretz Yisrael. And when they got to meet this person, she apparently was not average. She was someone that warranted having her name mentioned in the Chumash. She was a little bit special, answering our other question. And Yaakov was able to tell them, if you see special people like this who came from the environment that they did, you can start to get a sense of who exactly your grandmother was.
Yaakov told his children?
I guess. Or at least they picked... Right.
He was telling his kids that one of your grandmothers like...
Right, but you did know Devorah. But Devorah had been influenced by Rivka, and the kids had met Devorah.
He's saying when Devorah was sent to go pick up Yaakov, that's when the interaction was, and he was saying that?
Yeah, I assume so. So that was the hesped in this continuously morbid topic of the Chassam Sofer for his father-in-law, and maybe the hesped that Yaakov might have theoretically given for his mother to his kids who never met her. So I thought that was a very fascinating idea, and I thought that explains nicely the connection between Devorah and Rivka, and this idea that the Midrash assumes the reference to Devorah's death is actually also a reference to the death of Rivka. Okay. Another approach I wanted to take, and I'll tell you honestly, I knew this had to be true to some extent. The only question was finding it. Sometimes you have that instinct when you're looking at the Torah, you're looking at Chumash, you're looking at a Gemara. You're just waiting for somebody to say it. Either you totally missed the boat and what you're thinking is totally wrong, or there's something here and you just have to find it. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked all week. And I finally found one Dvar Torah on the internet that connected the two Devorahs. It had to be. Who is Devorah? If you ask that to anybody, who is Devorah? Devorah is Shokt in Perek Dalet. Right? If that's source number 5. Udvorah Yisha Neviah Eshes Lapidos. Devorah, the prophetess, is the wife of Lapidos. He Shoftas Yisrael Ba'is Hahi. Right? We have all these different judges of the Jewish people during this period in history before the building of the Beis HaMikdash while they're in the land of Israel. And Devorah is the lone female Shofetes of the Jewish people. What do we know about her? Well, we know who she was married to. And then the Navi says in Pasuk Hey, V'hi Yosheves Kachas Tomer Devorah. She sat beneath the date tree of Devorah. Bein Harama Uvein Beis El. Notice Beis El, similar to our parsha. I didn't notice that one for a while. Bahar Ephraim, in the mountains of Ephraim. Vayalu Eleha B'nei Yisrael La Mishpat. And the Jewish people went up to her for judgment. So she calls Pasuk Vav, Vayishlach Vatikra li Barak ben Avinoam. She calls Barak Mikedesh Naphtali, from the people of Naphtali. Vatomer Elav, and she says to him the following: Halo tzivah Hashem Elokei Yisrael. Behold, Hashem has commanded you. Lechu Mashachta Bahar Tavor. Go to the mountain of Tavor. V'lakachta imcha aseres alafim ish mi b'nei Naphtali mi b'nei Zvulun. Go and take these thousands of soldiers onto the mountain of Har Tavor. So what's going on over here? So if you look back a few psukim earlier to the beginning of the parak, we find that the Jewish people were not doing everything that God had hoped that they would be. And they have a lot of struggle with the nations around them. And particularly, we find out that the Jewish people were really in the control of Yavin, Melech Canaan, the Palestinians of that time. And they had a general whose name was Sisera. Sisera was a very powerful person. And Sisera, according to the Navi, was really the one that was controlling the Jewish people and making their lives very difficult at that point in time. He had this massive army, and they dominated the Jewish people for 20 years. Devorah calls in this guy, calls in Barak ben Avinoam, and she says, take your soldiers and head up to the mountain. Pasuk Zayin, Umashachti elefa al nachal kishon Sisra tzar tzeva yavin. Go up to the mountain and draw Sisera in to a trap, to a war, to a fight. The Esbrichbo v'Esamono, his horses and his soldiers, unsatihu biyadecha, and he will be given in your hands. Don't worry, the most powerful army around. Just go, stand up on top of the mountain and wait for him, and you'll be successful. That's the prophecy that Devorah relays to Barak. What does he say? Pasuk Ches, Vayomer Eleha Barak. I think this is unbelievable. Barak says back to Devorah, Im telchi imi v'halachti. If you come with, I will go. V'im lo telchi imi, and if you won't come with me, lo elech, I won't go. And they talk a little bit more, and we find that Devorah agrees. Vatomer, it's not on your sheets, Pasuk Tes, and Devorah says, Haloch elech imach. But you should just realize that you're not going to get the credit that you think you're going to get. You're not going to be the great Jewish general that saved the Jewish people if you're not willing to go on your own. I come with you, you're going to lose some of that credit. But that's what happens, and Barak wants her to come along. And what happens? Pasuk Yebez Vayagidu l'Sisra. Sisera finds out, Ki Allah Barak ben Avinoam har Tavor. He finds out that Barak is waiting for him on the top of the mountain. And the story goes on that Sisera was led into this trap, and his army was defeated by Barak and by Devorah, And that's when we have the Zirkind Devorah in Perek Hay. So Barak is nervous. Sisera is coming to start this war. Vatomer Devorah al Barak. What is the chizuk? What is the optimism in this mission? Devorah says to Barak, her inspiring speech, Kum, get up. Ki zeh hayom asher nasan Hashem es Sisera biyadecha. Today is the day that God has put Sisera in your hand. Halo Hashem yatsa lefanecha. Behold that God has come out before you. Vayered Barak mihar tavor v'aseres alafim ish acharav. And he goes out to fight this war. This is Devorah's inspiring message. I heard online this week, I saw online this week, an unbelievable connection between Rivka and Devorah. Or really between Devorah and Devorah. We mentioned that in the end of Parshas Chayei Sarah, Rivka, this 3-year-old girl, decides that she's going to go and marry Yitzchak. She's going to go out on her own. So Lavan of all people, really the family, as we'll see in Surah 6, the family really sends her out with their best wishes. They ask her if she wants to go, and she says, I do. If you look in Pasuk Nun Tes, verse 59, Vayishlach es Rivka achosam de'es May nekta. There's verse, look back at it again. They sent out Rivka, their sister, and her nursemaid, ve'es Eved Avraham ve'es Anashav. And they sent out Avraham's servant Eliezer and all his people. But now let's focus on verse 60, Pasuk Samach. Vayvarchu es Rivka vayomrula. They gave Rivka a blessing. Achosenu, they said, our sister, that's the impression that Lavan is talking, and not Besuel, his father. At hayila alfeiru lava. Behold, that you will become thousands of myriads. V'yiras zarich, and your children will inherit, or the shar oivav, the gates of their foes. This verse, at least in the first half, Achosenu at hayila alfeiru lava, our sister, you will be a great nation, is talking about her future offspring. That you will have this tremendous, large family, and your offspring will be successful against their enemies. That's what the bracha sounds like. But what I saw this week, which I thought was very interesting, is that maybe you could look at this pasuk a little bit differently. You look at this pasuk, and maybe the bracha that they're giving her is different. At hayila alfei revava is referring to Rivka herself. You yourself have to be thousands of myriads. You have to come first. You have to be everything that you're supposed to be. Fulfill your potential, whatever that is. And only after that, Yirash Zarich Ishar Oivav. This bracha Achosinu Atayu Alfei Revava is, a lot of people have this minhag at a wedding, that's the verse that the chassan says to the kala at the bedekin. It's interesting that Achosinu Atayu Alfei Revava is a bracha from love. But that's the minhag, comes from here. And on the one hand, this is a bracha that talks about the future. But first it's First you have to take care of yourself. And then you can worry about the future generations. Then it can be V'yirash Zarich Eishar Oivav. Rivka is a very ambitious young woman. 3 years old, leaves the family and moves on to go be a part of something bigger. And the bracha that she gets is also great advice. That if she wants to be successful in the future, she needs to make sure to develop herself at the same time. And maybe that's a very similar idea to the message that Devorah gives Barak. Vatomer Devorah el Barak, we saw in Pasuk Yudala, the last one in Source 5, she says, Ki zeh hayom asher nasan Hashem es Sisera biyadecha. Today is the day that Hashem is going to put Sisera in your hands. Why? Halo Hashem yatsa lefanecha. The simple interpretation of this verse is why? Because God, you're not fighting the war, God's out in front of you. But there might be another way to read this pasuk. Halo Hashem yatsa lefanecha, God is your priority. Before you go to worry about all of these things that are going on in your life, you need to make sure that your relationship with Hashem is squared up. That's number one. Halo Hashem yatsa lefanecha, God is in front of you, God is your priority. Then you don't have to worry about anything else. Then Sisera is biyadecha. As long as you put God first. Don't think that it's going to be up to your actions. It's going to be up to the way that you strategically arrange the battle. You just take care of your relationship with God. This message is really a message that can be attested to by, of all people, Devorah. And if you look at that first pasuk in Shoftim, the first pasuk we started with, the second pasuk, V'hi yosheves tachas tomer Devorah, there's a Midrash that says Devorah sat under the tree, that palm tree of Devorah. Sounds a little bit redundant, right? Devorah sat under her palm tree. Hi yosheves tachas tomer Devorah, there's a Midrash that suggests that it's referring to Devorah from our pasuk. That's the one I was looking for all week, and I finally found it. The nursemaid. It's her palm tree. It's Beit. It's the same place where she passed away. Devorah is sitting under the tree of Devorah. But why Devorah? Who is this person? We know nothing about her. But we do know one thing about her. We know that she was from the house of Lavan. And according to Rashi, she was with Rivka her entire life. She comes to Yaakov right now, and she is at that time the living testament to Rivka's success. She is the witness to Achosenu at Hayila Alfei Rivava. She's the one that can say, I saw that advice. I saw how Rivka started out as a small person, as a child, as an individual, and how she grew into being so much more. And that's the place where they mourn the death of Devorah, for whatever reason that they did, and they also mourn the death of Rivka because they understand the success of her life, even though she doesn't get that funeral at home. But that's what Alon Bachus was. That's that place of Beis El. And that's the same message that Devorah, the Shofet, gives to Barak before he goes out from Beis El to fight Sisera. To make sure to square off your relationship with God before you go to do anything else. And it's interesting because we mentioned to start that this whole discussion begins with Yaakov leaving after the rape of Dinah and the brothers calling out and violently revenging the attack on her, and the fear that he doesn't really know where to go. Yaakov is moving. Yaakov doesn't want to stay in the same place because they just went out and they killed a whole lot of people. And it's interesting when you look at these psukim in Parak Lamed Hey, what does he do? Vayiven sham mizbeach vayikra lamakom kel beis kel. That Yaakov stops and he builds a mizbeach, because Yaakov apparently internalizes that same message, that he's concerned about the potential repercussions of Shimon and Levi's actions in revenging the attack on Dinah. And Yaakov's response is not to go sharpen his swords and to go prepare for battle. He stops and he makes sure, before I do anything else, before we move on, we're going to build a mizbeach. And I wonder if it's all kind of the same message. This doesn't explain why Devorah has to be mentioned by name. That I don't know. But it is interesting in the way that it highlights the message of Devorah and Barak. And I think it maybe has an impact on Yaakov also, and it explains why we put Rivka's death and Devorah's death in the same place, because Devorah is the witness to Rivka's life. And that's why it's Alon Bachus, because the tears that they cried over Rivka and the tears that they cried on the death of Devorah are pretty much one and the same. Devorah is the only person. It's interesting. Devorah in these psukim, the nursemaid, is the only one that sees Rivka in both lights. She sees Rivka at home, and she sees Rivka in the house of Yitzchak. This is Rivka that brought all those miracles back to the house after Sarah died. Devorah is the person that saw that success. So really the loss of Devorah is also, I guess, the loss of Rivka as well.